Hey, I'm Morgan, and this is the PS We Expire podcast.
The Pink Book came into being early in our caregiving journey. And it was more out of necessity than anything, but it's turned into really our caregiving companion. And it's our lifeline for having the care for everyone, Ben's care team, actually. And the way it started, so Ben was probably two, and we had two other kids, small kids. And my father-in-law was in a serious car accident, and it was late at night, and he was undergoing emergency surgery. So my wife and I needed to get to the hospital to see what was going on, or we wanted to get to the hospital. So we called a neighbor of ours who happened to be a nurse, saying, "Could you just come stay with the kids? We don't know what's going on, don't know how long we'll be." And she said, "Sure, absolutely." And then before we left, she said, "Okay, now if Ben wakes up, does he get any meds? What happens in the morning? What does he eat?" And of course, she had no idea what the routines were and even what meds he was on, because we did all the care, of course, because he, number one, he was our kid. So, I mean, we kind of did that. But anything that if anyone else had to step in, they would have no idea. So it was a bit of a panic moment. And at that time, we said, "Okay, don't worry about it. Just call us if something happens, and we'll figure it out." And so the next day, we said to ourselves, we're not going to get caught again. So we wrote down a few of the essential care information around medications and nutrition. He had some allergies, and just basic of the care routines. How do you get them up? Like, what do you do first, second, and third? And in fact, we realized that the medications were not even in the same place. Like, they were scattered all over the house, and that was fine for us, but it just didn't make sense. So we wrote all that stuff down on pieces of paper, and we found a pink binder in a drawer, and we just basically put all those pages in that pink binder, and that became the Pink Book. And that name kind of stuck, and it became sort of our lifeline to, okay, if he gets on new medication, we got to write all that down, like who prescribed it, where do you pick it up, all the details around it, and then how do you administer it? Can he swallow it? Do you have to mix it with food, and all those details? And little by little, it grew into, this is how you care for Ben. Beyond the basic stuff of feeding and dressing and all of that stuff and all the other routines. This was around how that his care was, so that it would be consistent and thoughtful and personal towards him. So, what we then kind of looked at it as, this was our lifeline. This is something we did, and didn't really think beyond outside of sort of our situation. And then when we got into bringing Soaring Families into being, one of our key things was around, I guess one of the key big game changers for us was realizing we couldn't do all the care ourselves, nor should we do all the care ourselves. And we started to figure out, how do you build a team around you, right? And when I say team, that could be one or two people. It's not, a football team, but it's a way for you to not have to be the person's hands and feet every single minute of every single day. And I guess what I should have pointed out is Ben requires 24-hour care, right? So it's something that you have to, stay on top of. And in doing so, in building this training program we call the Caregiver Support Formula, which shows you how to build a team around you. The Pink Book was one of the key resources that you needed when you did that, right? If you had other people to come in, how do you train them? How do you show them what has to be done? And then that has then led to, well, it's a big decision point for people to build a team around you. You don't need a team to have a Pink Book. But so every family caregiver should have a Pink Book. You need to write that stuff down somehow in an organized fashion. And that's our push now, is to, well, even if you can't get your head around, bringing someone in for care, at least get your own care situation simplified and organized. And that's really where the Pink Book comes in.
There's a couple of things that I really like about this this product that you've created and this tool that you've created for families, is that, even though you had a nurse come over and spend the night with Ben, even if she was familiar with those types of needs in general, she may not be in tune with his needs specifically. And so, even for parents who have children, on the autism spectrum, and their children have specific comfort things for them, or specific tactile things or foods that are specific to their child, you wouldn't know that unless it was written down somewhere. And I love this idea. I know we talked about this when we had our first introduction, but the freedom that comes with moving all of the knowledge of that person's care out of your head into a book, onto paper. So can you talk a little bit about how that tool frees up our minds to be able to be present with our loved ones?
Sure. There's all kinds of stuff, embedded in that. And most family caregivers will feel that they have to do everything themselves. And if they even have to, raise their hand for help, they feel like they failed in some way. So it becomes almost um, a process of you continuing to take on more and more things, and you typically take it on more and more in your head. And what happens is that it's not and there's a little bit of I would say caregiver guilt built in, because you have this obligation and this strong desire to do your best every single day, right? Because it is your family member. Um, and what happens is, as things sort of add up and start piling up, you can start forgetting things, or you can start making mistakes, and or maybe it's something part of the care routine that you haven't done in weeks because you haven't needed to, and so it brings a lot of stress to your day. But if we're written down, what happens is then you don't have to remember all of it. You can you can free up your mind for other more important things, with when it comes to your loved one's care. And so it is, it seems fairly trivial to all just write it down. What's that going to do? But then you don't have to remember everything.
Mm-hmm.
All you have to do is know where your pink book is and go find that piece of information, that page about that medication, or, what the care routine is. And you mentioned something really important, is that it is meant to be very personal, so that the care can be consistent, and thoughtful, and so that the person being cared for can expect that. And for example, so if you have, if your family member gets agitated for some reason, right? What are the things you need to do
Mm.
to calm them down? Who would know what those were? There's probably some general steps you could follow, but the Pink Book is meant to have the very specific, okay, when this happens, these are the steps you follow, or this is the person you call, or whatever the situation happens to be. And then it doesn't matter really who is providing the care. That's all documented. It's going to be consistent, and it's hopefully going to work out for you.
Wonderful.
In my death and dying class at the university, we have been talking a lot about what it means to have a good death. And I thought about what are some of the reasons why people don't have conversations about what end of life looks like for them. And I think part of it is that oftentimes we think about our end of life care just as like, who gets my stuff when I go? But it's so much more than that. What does a good death actually mean? And I think one of the biggest barriers to people answering these questions is that they don't even know which questions to ask. They don't know what some of the terms mean, like hospice or palliative care. They don't really know what life support is like. So if we don't know what questions to ask, that can keep us from having these conversations at all. So in order to address that and help people, I created a box of conversation cards that are all about the conversations to have when you want to have a good death. It's a set of 58 questions ranging from quality of life to legacy and meaning. Got to have a dash of humor in there. Conversation starters for a good death. They're available now. You can buy your own pack and have conversations with your loved ones and make sure that your wishes are known as a gift to people who are going to be taking care of you in the end.
wonderful. I already know the answer to this question, but I imagine that some people are thinking, "Oh my gosh, so like where do I start?" So can you talk about the templates for the Pink Book and what types of things people include in their Pink Books?
Sure. So there's what we've done initially is what we would call kind of the starter kit of the things you should probably think about, writing down. And when I say it's starter, there's actually 45 different templates. A lot of them are similar, but nevertheless. But that's one of the things that we've had families come back. Well, I don't have time to even do all the things I need to do now. You want me to fill out a book? And so the idea is that you don't need to create this 100-page book over a weekend or tomorrow or next week. You just pick the one thing, one page today. Takes you 10 minutes to fill it out, whether it's your it's some new medication that you have, right? Just take some time. And the way it's designed is it is a digital download, so you can either the templates there, you can enter them on your laptop or your computer, update them that way and save them, or you can just print the page out and handwrite them if you want. But it's up to you, whatever the easiest thing to do. And if you start with just one page today and then maybe another page tomorrow, you'll start to feel a little more comfortable with the process of downloading it out of your head. And then it becomes a little bit easier. And I can tell you that after a couple of weeks, suddenly you've got 15 pages in your Pink Book, and now it looks like a book, right? So it's something that just start today. It's all about getting started. It's all about taking that one step. Sit with it, see if it works for you, and then go to the next step.
That's probably one of the biggest barriers that people have to creating things like this, creating new
Yeah.
habits, is it's looking at the massive task ahead of them and saying, there's no way I can get this done. So I really appreciate the advice to take it just one page at a time. We've kind of talked about it in context of care for dependents, as far as our like children.
Right.
But I know that your methods are not just about caring for dependent children, but can you talk a little bit about how that's expanded beyond just kids that are under 18 that have specific needs into any type of caregiving situation? Because I want to point out to my listeners that the vast majority of us will be caregivers at some point. If it's not
Sure.
for a disabled child or a child with special needs now, often it'll be an aging parent, or there will be some type of disability, even if it's a short-term disability for a spouse. These things are really important to think about and plan for. So can you talk about how it's a tool that is used in a wider caregiving application?
For sure. So I guess one thing and I think I mentioned that to you, Morgan, when we chatted a little while ago, is that caregiving has been our life. Ben's in his 30s, right? I mean, I wouldn't be talking to you today unless we had people around us to help us. But I also had my father also was blessed to be able to live to the age of 100.
Hmm.
And so, and fortunately, his mind was, sharp till the day he died, and we didn't have to deal with any of those things. But your body's not designed to be 100 years old, right? We noticed, and it took him a while to figure out that, and he was a physician his whole life, so he knew all about health related things and how things were going. Um, but kind of once he hit 90, then things started to not work very well, and getting around the house, and even he was still driving. We didn't want him to be driving, but he was still driving, and that's another whole topic of you know elderly people who won't give up their license because they just don't have the reaction time and all of that stuff. But nevertheless, we know what it's like to care for an aging parent, right? And he was very stubborn at times, because he didn't, and it's all about losing your independence and having to rely on people when you've never had to do that your whole life. Um, but what in his situation, he realized that he needed help. So there was a home care agency that provided some people to help him just for a little bit through the day. Um, and then it became to the point where they because it wasn't the same person every day, you had to write things down. And so we kind of created a little bit of a mini pink book for him because he didn't want things too explicit, right? He didn't
Hmm.
want people to know that someone was caring for him.
Hmm.
There was a bit of a pride thing, but nevertheless, we helped to get that organized for him. And it really didn't matter. And in general, the pink book isn't for a specific condition or disability or health issue. It's all about how do you and your family provide the care, and these are the pieces that are are part of the care. So and the other side is also currently my mother-in-law is going through some health issues, and she just turned 90.
Hmm.
And so the whole notion of family caregiving, it's been our life forever.
Hmm.
So it's something that we understand in it's probably too much in depth some days, but and the tools and the I guess the approach to caring isn't limited to a specific set of conditions. It's we've made it so that it is generalized, but yet as a family member you can then take that and customize it for your situation.
I like too that you told me about a client that you have who uses it long distance with a family member, so that the family member is the one that has the book, if I'm understanding
Right.
this correctly. And
Yeah.
so it's a collaborative approach to filling out the templates.
Yeah. So this client of ours, who's now become a friend, she I think she lives in New York, and her mom lives in South Carolina. And her mom's fairly independent, but she still needs help. And so she's used the Pink Book for her mom. She went there, initially when she got it, and she visits regularly. Um, and what she told me is that not only does it help with other family members when they come in or other caregivers, but her mom uses it
Hmm.
in her because she doesn't always remember about certain medications or what did we do in this situation, which
Hmm.
I found really interesting. I'd never even considered that it would be for the family member, right? But she sees the value in it because it's there as kind of a reference, and in some ways it's her companion, that it's something there that's trusted, and she can access it whenever she needs to.
That's awesome. Do you can we talk now about Ben? Can you
Yeah,
tell us kind of what the experience was like having him after your other kids, and what life looked like for you guys in the early days? And I know the Pink Book is just a small piece of the whole caregiving puzzle for you. So I would love for people to hear what prompted this type of advocacy and support for families, and what that looked like for you guys.
sure. So I mean, Ben's story is well, it has been life changing for us. I mean, we had two other small children when Ben was born, and uh, it was a typical pregnancy, if I can call it that. Um, and there were no issues sort of along the way. And then, but an hour after Ben was born, um, we, or actually, just after he was born, they noticed a little rash on his tummy, and they said, "We're just going to take him to the neonatal unit to get it checked out, and we'll talk to you later." But then when we went to the unit to see where he was and why he hadn't come back. We met one of the neonatologists who told us that he was very sick, that
Hmm.
he had an enlarged liver and spleen. His head was too small. His blood platelet count was dangerously low. And then at the end said, he may not live the day. And it was kind of all this run-on sentence when an hour before that, he looked fine to us other than this little rash. And what had happened is that the rash was just the sort of the first indication that something was wrong. And that's when they, did all these tests and realized that he was in trouble. His platelet count was, I don't know, 100, and it should be like 400 or something like that. So there was lots of issues. And I guess the only thing that we heard out of that was that he may not live the day. We didn't hear about all the other, we couldn't process any of the other stuff. But after 3 or 4 days, they started to try and isolate what the problem was, and he was starting to stabilize a little bit. Still in this incubator with all these wires coming out of him. And we met a neurologist who had done some tests and said, here were the issues neurologically. And then he summarized it and said, Ben may never walk, talk, or go to school. And that has stuck with me for 32 years. And
Hmm.
so it was, you think about any one of those individually, right? Not being able to walk or not talking. And then suddenly, what do you mean you can't go to school? How do you know that? He's only 4 days old. And that kind of became the marker for me to realize what our life was going to be like, right? That was essentially, you've been sentenced to 24-hour care for however long Ben's going to live. Because if you can't do any of those things, like, what else is there?
Hmm.
And I'll tell you that, the first year was hell. There were, we really didn't understand what was going on, and it was more of just trying to, survive each day, because there were health issues. We had to go back for regular tests and regular, probably every 2 weeks until his blood levels were stabilized. You had to make sure things were okay. So you spent your whole life in the hospital in the first year, in one way, shape, or form. Um, but then we realized after a couple of years that, yeah, he did have health issues, but he was growing and he was developing. And we did start to see that he had these other, deficits, if you will. He was profoundly deaf, so he had to wear hearing aids. He had a seizure disorder, and he had some other related things to that. And it was all about trying to manage and maintain what those were while having two other kids,
Hmm.
making sure that they had a typical upbringing, if you will. But it was, you had to go. We were in an area of the country where we didn't have a children's hospital. We had to drive about 4 hours to get there. So we went there 3 times a year just to see what was going on, because the specialists in our area probably hadn't seen as many kids as they had in other areas. And it was sort of management of Ben's care, um, with these experts, and he wanted he needed orthopedic surgeries and different things like that. Um, but it kind of all went to the point where I won't say it became normal, but
Hmm.
this is just life with Ben, right? And you kind of have this different daily routine when it came around him. And at the point of, when he turned 5, we said, he's got to go to school. Like his other siblings went to school, so why can't Ben go to school? And that's a whole other story, but nevertheless, it was kind of the start for us to say that there's no reason why Ben can't follow the normative pathways of life, if I can
Hmm.
call them that. Get an education, get a job, all of that. He'll need a lot of support, but who says that he should not be able to at least try some of that stuff? And that led, I guess, in some sort of natural way for us to be advocates, and really, champions of his life when we had no training around it. Right? It was just this drive to say, well, you can't limit Ben from that. We'll just have to find who can support him. And that I'm simplifying it, oversimplifying it, but that was basically the drive for us. Um, and then there were highs and lows. We had some great educators. We had some not so good educators in the school system, and it became, it was Ben became known within the whole school district, and we were able to advocate to get enough support in the classroom for him. But they still didn't know how to teach Ben because he couldn't talk.
Hmm.
And so a lot of what that neurologist had said was actually coming true, right? He couldn't walk without support. He couldn't talk, and I guess maybe we can get into that later. But he does now communicate with a communication device. But he was going to school, And I guess what led us even further was that, it was probably, I don't know, probably Ben was probably 10 or something. And we kind of realized at one point that, wow, we made it 10 years, and we're still able to talk about it and we're still relatively sane. And then one day I met Ben's brother was, he had choir practice and I went to pick him up. And there were, I don't know, 25 sets of parents there waiting for their kids to come out, and they were delayed for some reason. And one of the families had, um, I guess, a younger child with them who, obviously had some other disability or other challenges, and the son was not happy, but and the father got really upset. And I could tell that he had lost his patience with him, and he really just wanted to get out of there. And at the time, I thought, I know exactly the level of stress and how you've got nothing left in the tank, what that feels like. And for a moment, I thought, I'm going to go over and talk to him and tell him it's okay. And because I don't know, there's this sort of um, calling to say, I can help this family. I didn't do that. I just sort of watched it from a distance, but
Mm.
it was sort of the trigger to say, we haven't made all kinds of mistakes, but we've also made it 10 years and we've learned a lot along the way. And that was sort of the beginning of why we created Soaring Families, is that it was, we've got a lot to share with people. We can help families. Why should they have to go through the same mistakes we did? And it was all sort of that, like a step by step of realizing of how much we had accomplished, and that we shouldn't just keep all that knowledge and
Hmm.
stuff we've learned to ourselves.
I think one of the things that I've heard many times from special needs parents is so much shame and guilt about those moments that you're talking about with the dad who you can just tell is like just like millimeters away from the tipping point.
Yeah,
And how many parents feel so much shame and guilt about being burnt out and then responding to their child in ways that they wish they could take back.
it's
um,
true. Yeah,
yeah, and it's a really hard piece of the puzzle because as we're talking about what are some of the most important supports for families, it's like that real tangible in-person care from other people, not just for your child but for yourself. So can we talk a little bit about how you work with families to build a team around them? Because and I've heard this over and over again from families, is like, we can't find anyone, or we find someone and they're only here for 2 weeks and we spent all that time training them how to do this and then they're not here anymore. And that's a real barrier to people asking for help, is the worry about the time and energy that goes into training someone and then not having them not stay long term. So could we talk a little bit about how you help families build a team around them, no matter how small?
yeah. So I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. It's not easy. And in fact, COVID has probably made it harder. A
Mm.
lot of people left the industry as a result of that period of 3 years. So, the resource pool, if you will, is thinner. However, there are still people in the system, and it's getting better. What I've noticed is that more people are coming back into it. But, great questions of how do you find the right person? And that's been, I guess, a challenge of ours and a challenge of everybody's is, if how do you know that this person is going to be the right fit for your home? And when we started out, we just hired people or brought people in by word of mouth.
Mm.
You kind of know this person, and that's really important. You need to have references in the formal sense and in the character sense of this person, she's a good person, and she knows this person you're going to bring in. And if they're kind of the same, then you probably have a pretty good indicator that they're going to fit. Um, And when we, as we got down the road, we the people that we knew that we could bring in, it got fewer and fewer, and realized as Ben Care got a little more complex, we just couldn't rely on that set of people to do things. So we had to bring in strangers, if you will.
Mm.
And before we started Soaring Families, and actually, while we were still doing that on a part-time basis, my wife and I manage teams in our work lives, right? So you know how to hire people, you know how to help them and lead them through different challenging things. And so we thought, we know what to do. That's what we've done. But what we quickly found out is that if it's in a workplace or it's in your home, it's very different. People are still people, but you can't approach it in exactly the same way. And we learned the hard way. And so that led us to, okay, if we're going to be having to do this for the rest of our lives, we better get our act together. Not only for us, but Ben needs the right people, right? So how do we do this? And so little by little, we kind of built this, I mentioned it earlier, the caregiver support formula of these are the steps that we follow. These are how we first find the people. How do we interview them? Because you have to have a conversation with somebody. Even if you're bringing somebody in from an agency, you just don't show up on the first day. They could show up and you give them the pink book, but nevertheless, you still have to have a conversation. Are they going to be the right fit? Just because Sally's a registered nurse doesn't mean she's going to fit into my home if she's only worked in a hospital setting, right? That's not always an easy transition. And as I say, we learned the hard way, but then we put in these steps and sort of these filters to say, okay, we'll have a phone conversation with them, and then we'll meet them, at a coffee shop and see what their mannerisms are like, and ask them a little bit more about their, who they've looked after before, what their training was, and then if it sort of passes those steps, then we think, okay, maybe we'll actually show them into our home, that they seem like reasonable people. You've gone through some reference checks, although those only get you so far, right? People are going to give you references who are going to give them a bad rating, right? So, I mean, on the other hand, if you get enough of them, we always ask for 4, and people can't always come up with 4, because it's the more you get, the more information you have, right? But you have to deal with what you have, and then even when you go through all of this, there's still this. You have the right vibe when they came into your home? Does it feel right? Does your family member feel comfortable? Like, how did they react? And so that we documented and put into this training program that we follow all the time ourselves when we're bringing somebody in. So that's kind of getting the right person. And then, how do you make it work in your home? And there's basically 2 other steps that you have got to figure out. One is you've got to get your home organized, right? Because the person who's coming in, it's their workplace, regardless of whether you're paying them or someone else is. It's their workplace, right? They're not your friends. That's one of the things we want to emphasize with families, is that the person you bring in can never be your friend. You can be friendly with them, but you don't ever want to cross that boundary, because if things go south or you have an issue and you're too chummy with them, that's really not a good situation to be in. So think of it as that your home becomes the workplace, and then say, okay, what does that mean? You have to get things organized in such a way, and that's part of our again, part of the formula is how do you figure that out? What are boundaries you should never cross by doing that? And not to make it uncomfortable, but there are things that, there are trade-offs in that you've brought someone in, you've lost a little bit of your privacy, right? But you, at the same time, then you don't have to provide the care either. So as I say, it is a trade-off, but you have to figure out how do you get that organized. And one of the ways you get it organized is the pink book, right? You start writing down, here are the steps to follow. These are the meds, this is the routines, and whatever the case is. And then the third part of it is, you've spent all this time getting stuff organized, you found the right person. As you say, how do you keep them, long term if they're really good? how do you keep them bringing their best every day? And that's where kind of the people leadership comes in. And so we took the best practices that we learned in our work lives and overlaid them onto a home care setting and said, you know what, you if you follow these things, if you do these regularly, chances are you're going to keep the relationship growing and it's going to benefit everybody. And you don't have to be an HR expert to kind of do these. They're pretty straightforward and common sense. But as I say, even though we had done it for years, they weren't common sense when they're in your home, right? So you still have to have a little bit of formality around it to keep things on track and to make sure that, things are going in a good direction, because, anybody can have a bad day,
Hmm.
right? Everyone has baggage. Everyone has things that they have in their own home life. You don't want them to bring that into your home. You got enough to worry about, right? So there are things you can put in place to make sure that stays in a good situation. And it also helps you to highlight when things might be off a little bit, and you can either address them when they're small, or maybe it's gone to the point where you have to say goodbye to the person because it's not working out anymore. I know I ramble a little bit, but
That was perfect.
it is a little bit of it's a process, right, that you follow, and life changes, you change, your family member changes, but it's all about understanding that it is fluid, and you just try to stay on top of it.
The two places that I want to go to next, I'll ask them, and then I'll see if you're cool with going in one of the places. You
Okay.
mentioned a couple times the phrase that you learned the hard way, and so I'm curious if you would be willing to share what the hard way was. And then the second place I want to go after that is to talk about the shift in identity from parent to caregiving role, and how, because I know we talked about that on our first call, was um, being able to adopt the persona, I guess, of being a manager of the household and a manager of your child's care, and how that's different from kind of like the parenting role. But first, yeah, I wanted to hear if you would feel comfortable sharing what learning the hard way actually means in your experience.
Um, so what the first thing that pops to mind is um, one of the caregivers that we had. She had actually stayed with us for, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 years, maybe longer. And it was it was before we had this caregiver support formula. You know, she came to our house every day. Everything seemed to be, on track, and we weren't really, managing things. It was just we had, life, and there was a lot of stuff going on, and I was traveling a lot. And then one day she left her shift on a Thursday. I think it was probably she stayed till maybe 8 p.m. or something. And then about 20 minutes later, her husband called and tore a strip off me and said, you've been treating her so poorly. She's worked her last shift. She's never coming back. All these things that we had done, which were untrue. And you're sitting there on, I thought it was, I didn't really know what to say. It
Mm,
sort of took me off guard. And I said, well, can I talk to her? No, you can't talk to her. No, you're never talking to her again. And I could sort of hear her in the background. Um, and so I had no idea what happened. Like she was happy, normal person leaving, after that shift. And then her husband's, talking the way he was. And after I hung up, I thought, okay, well, Ben's got to go to school tomorrow and I've got to
hmm,
work and all, and then it was, well, it's not just tomorrow, it's next week and the rest, right? So now what, right? It was a big shocker. And it was at that point where we said, okay, this, like, what, I don't know what happened, but we've got to get, things together. And we were left hanging for weeks until
hmm,
we actually found someone else who could bring in, who could come in. And it was at that point where we said, okay, we've got to do better at doing background checks and understanding who they are, but also managing it every day, right? You just can't. can't let it go and think everything's going to be good forever. And in fact, the like I'm not sure that I don't know what the tipping point was for her that this happened, because she never showed emotion that she was unhappy in what she was doing. But obviously, there were other things outside of what her work
Hmm.
that just was too much. And this was kind of the tipping point, and we just happened to be in the line of fire, I think. But nevertheless, you want to be able to have some insight into that because you could be left with with nobody. And the other side of that was, okay, yeah, we've hired a person and we need a backup person because if people call in sick, that happens. You can't just have one person. You need someone. What's your backup plan? And that then led into making this a little more formal,
Hmm.
on how to do that. So that was kind of a big learning the hard way, thinking everything was cool, but it really wasn't, right? It seemed that way, but obviously stuff else was kind of percolating. And I think the other, um, learning the hard way is that there really wasn't anyone to kind of take us by the hand. Um, there, you were kind of left on your own in a lot of ways, and it was just knowing, I guess, feeling that a loneliness that you think no one else is able to, doesn't even know what's going on, and assuming that people wanted to help when there really wasn't anyone that could kind of lay things out in a trajectory. It's not that people just said, there's nothing we can do, have a nice life, but at the same time, there was no one you could go to or no organization you could go to that kind of could oversee the whole journey,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's kind of what we're trying to do with Soaring Families. We're not experts in everything, but there are we know the journey. We know the highs and lows and how you can try to get things back on track when they fall off track. And so I guess the not realizing how complex it would be, especially when you're neck deep in the care,
Mm-hmm.
you don't see all the other things that are happening around you.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking, people go to school full time for years to be able to offer the level of care and insight that many parents are thrown into when their child either has an accident or is born with some type of additional needs. And I remember thinking that like so many times, like how do I make sure that I'm not like poisoning my child with an accidental overdose of their medication or something like that, where it's like I don't have any training for this.
Yeah.
And a phrase that many parents hear a lot is people telling them, I don't know how you do this. And the parents are thinking, well, I don't know either. It's sink or swim, buddy. Like you just kind of have to figure it out. And I think that's a very salient point, that many parents feel so alone
Mm-hmm.
when they're navigating all of this because nobody really is there. Like you suddenly are the adult in the situation and you just have to figure it out. And it's extremely overwhelming and oftentimes, not just stressful, but in the ways that parenting is inherently stressful, but it's so next level with the managing of this type of care. And I guess I didn't realize how well the question about learning the hard way segues into this other question about the identity as the caregiver and the manager of care versus like the parental role. And
Mm-hmm.
so, when you said when the woman just up and quit,
Mm-hmm.
and you realized, okay, like we have to be doing some things differently as far as a backup person, but also what types of conversations do you have with people who are in these caregiving roles alongside of you to make sure that things are going okay? So do you mind talking a little bit about how the role of being a manager of your person's care versus being the parent, how that's different, and some of the maybe the tactics of being a good manager, especially for people like me who like had zero experience in corporate America or in any type of like leadership or managerial role at all.
Hmm.
That's like uncharted territory when it comes to being able to hire people to help with your person's care.
Sure. So I guess the role the roles are I don't know. I never really most days I don't even think about them. They're um, when Ben was younger, he was your child, so you just did what you needed to do. That was just because you were the dad, all right, or the parent. But as care got more complicated, and at age of 5, he wasn't feeding himself, he wasn't dressing himself, and so what you would do for an infant, you still were doing
Mm.
when he was 5 years old. And that's I don't know where the boundary is where that goes from caring to caregiving, um, but you just did it, and even though you would never, and I would never call myself I'm Ben's caregiver, I'm his dad. It's you don't Most people don't self-identify as a caregiver or a family caregiver, yet they're doing all the same things that if you hired someone to do would
Hmm.
be doing, right? Medications and hygiene and everything about that. Um, and then it kind of got to the point where I guess all the care, if I can or to call it that, takes so much time through the day. It just does, right? It takes so much time for feeding and all the other personal care, and anything to do with picking up meds and like you name it. There's a block of time out of your day that's strictly care stuff if you were to write it all down. And I remember one time, we were when I don't know, I guess Ben was probably, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10, and we went for what they would call a feeding assessment, right, with one of the OTs, because they wanted to see, what other types of foods he could handle and this and that. And they started writing down, like they watched us for a day. That's really what it was, watching. And they wrote down the start and end times of all these things. And when I looked at it later, it was, the feeding part of the day was 2.5 hours, right? That's just, I'd never thought of it that way, right? So out of the whole day that you spent that much time feeding, and then you spent that much time doing what other care, and it's a huge amount of time that somebody's got to do it. And it got to the point where I wasn't always around, or my wife wasn't always around. So but yet that 2.5 hours had to get done. So who's going to do it? And that looking at it very, I don't know if clinically is the right word, but very, unemotionally, that it came to the point where, okay, the care then is all about who can provide it and who's the most suitable to provide that. And then eventually there's physical care as well. And as you get older, you just can't do the things you did when you were younger because your body won't let you do that. And if you look at it from that point of view, it becomes kind of not a simple exercise, but an exercise in saying, okay, here's all the things that have to happen in the day. Who's able to do that? Right? I can do some of it. I can do all of it, but I don't really need to do all of it, and I don't want to do all of it. And then if you have sort of those aspects of care looked after by somebody else, then those 2.5 hours that I spent with feeding before, I have 2.5 hours back for me that I can then start to see a bigger picture of what care looks like. And I can start to think about, okay, what are we going to do next week? And what are we going to do? What sort of goals can we set for Ben, or things we can try in the next 6 months? When you're, you know, deep in all the day-to-day stuff, you don't have any time to think about that. You don't have any energy to think about that. And then that leads you more into, I guess, sort of like becoming a manager. You start to organize the care, and then you start to oversee the care,
Mm.
in one way, shape, or form. And that part of it, especially, for some of the personal care and some of the daily routines, if you're not doing them yourself, you want to make sure they're done properly. You want to make sure that they're following the pink book. And the that then leads to what things should I do, maybe on a daily basis or some sort of regular basis, to make sure those are being followed, and that the person who's providing the care feels empowered to make suggestions if they think there's some better way of doing it, and just building that home environment where it's fun to come to, and people want to be able to do that. And that's it's a gradual transition into seeing it in those terms, because it's your family member, right? It's not You're not a manager in some long-term care facility where the people
Mm.
are not your family. You still have, but you still have to address those activities and those issues in order for the care to keep evolving and keep getting better.
That's a
Does that
great way
help?
to, yeah, that's a great way to summarize it. Because I was trying to think of, just for myself, I think that one of the things that changed so much for me over the decade plus that I cared for my daughter
Right.
is that I learned how to become an advocate for her. That was a different type of skill set than I think, well, like quote unquote, like normal parenting requires of you, because
Sure.
there's something about like being in so many appointments with medical specialists where you have to speak up on behalf of your child in a way that, because it's something that's outside of the expertise of so many doctors, that you as the parent, you step into this role that is required of you in a different way than it would be if your child didn't have those additional needs. And that was a really, I mean, I couldn't point to like one experience where that happened, but not only did that change the way that I viewed Annie's care, but it also changed the way that I viewed my own care. And
Mm.
one of the things that I just feel like I hit on ad nauseum in my podcasts and the places where I speak is how important it is for the parent or the primary caregiver to take care of themselves. And that is often an area that is overlooked in when we talk about holistic care for a special needs child. And for example, that if the parent is not well slept, not
Mm.
well fed, is not still engaging in activities that release stress, that bring them a lot of joy, then the level of care just inevitably goes down for the person they're caring for as well, because you don't have anything to give at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I appreciate so much about the work that you're doing is that, like you said, if the feeding requires 2.5 hours, there are so many parents that would think, well, if I can do it, then I should do it.
Mm-hmm.
And you said something really important, that was that you don't necessarily want to be the person that's doing that. And I think a lot of parents struggle with saying, actually, I could let this piece of their care go to somebody else, and that it's not selfish or wrong for me to use that time for something for me.
Right. No, absolutely. There came a point, Ben's a man now, but there came a point where no one would want their dad in their face doing
Mm,
whatever, right? There's and even if, I guess, if we didn't have anybody, then somebody's got to do it. He couldn't do it himself, but nevertheless, there are sort of limits that where you should be providing this type of care. And that not only would that free up time for yourself, but then it gives your family member a break from
yeah,
you,
right.
right? And
Yeah. Yep.
whether they can express that need or desire or whatever, um, that's still inherently true. And it comes down to, you could even look at it as there are certain things that have to be done through the day, and should you really be doing all of them? Like, are they at a level where you're taking those 2.5 hours for the feeding or the nutrition side of it? What if you just spent 2.5 hours with them like going somewhere,
Mm.
right? And if you really get down to it, most people, most family caregivers desire to spend time with their family member. Just spend time. I don't want to have to do the toileting. I don't want to have to do all the other meal prep. Those are all important, but when it comes down to it, the person really wants to spend time with them. So how do I free up all this care stuff in order for me to spend more time with them? Now, maybe I can't get the full 2.5 hours, but nevertheless, you're moving more towards that. And I think the other aspect that just sort of reminded me as you were talking is that the sooner you can um, introduce a non-family member into the care, the sooner that relationship starts to develop, because you don't want to leave it until there's some crisis or some oh no moment when you have to introduce someone because you like maybe something happened to me, right? And
Mm.
suddenly you've got to bring someone else in, right? There's no relationship there. And a lot of the care is about building relationships with, your son or your parent or whomever. And if you can do it when times are good, then chances are it's going to, flourish and develop a lot better than if you were in a crisis situation. So if you can see that coming, and that's a hard decision for people to make, because as I say, you feel like, well, I'm failing. If I can't do it
Mm.
all, then I've done something wrong. And that's absolutely the wrong way to look at it. There comes a point where it shouldn't actually be you. You have to figure out what that balance is, where it can be partly you and but partly somebody else.
I remember this shifting for me in a big way when Annie went to school and had a one-on-one aide in the classroom. And when this aide told me how much Annie changed her life, it was like a light bulb moment for me where I was like, oh, like this isn't just about me getting a break, but it also is about sharing Annie with other people. And that's a really exciting thing that, these kids have an uncanny ability to change other people's lives for the better also, because they're these amazing little examples of the intrinsic value and worth of all people, regardless of ability, regardless of
You bet.
contribution. It's that they're worth seeing fully who they are just because they're here. And the goal of freeing up the time for us as parents to also be engaged in that way with our child is a gift, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, in those people, whether they were students or, people within the school system, she's left a lasting impression. I
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I still meet people today, and Ben hasn't been in high school since for a while, and they'll come up and say, "Oh, hi, Ben," and I'm looking at them thinking, "Who are you?" Right? And it was because, he was I don't know, a teacher or something within that you just randomly meet like years later. And I always became known as Ben's dad. Like Ben was the focal point,
Yep.
right? They didn't know my name. Oh, you're Ben's
Mm-hmm.
dad, right? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
right. So it's absolutely true. They, um, the just being in their presence is there's something different, right? It,
Mm.
it does leave a more lasting impression, um, for the better.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Not that long ago, I heard a story about a young man who I believe he had cerebral palsy, but he was homebound, and um, he was a big gamer. He was online playing games all the
Oh
time.
yeah.
And when he passed away, all of these people came out of the woodwork and said, "Hey, I'm friends with your son." He had this whole community built up through this game, so many friends, people
Wow.
who came in person from all over the world to his funeral, and his parents were absolutely floored. They had no idea that he had this side of his life, because he was living semi independently, away from them. But I think it's a really beautiful reminder that, regardless of the skills or the aptitudes or whatever of the people that we're caring for, whether even people who seem to be losing their function due to something like dementia,
Mm.
aging and neurological decline, it does not do anything to the worthiness or the ability of that person to still change other people's lives, to still give and receive love. And that's just, it's a really wonderful thing to keep at the forefront. Can, okay, so I'm thinking about how the phrase that the doctor said to you about he won't walk, talk, or go to school.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell everyone how you saw that change? And I mean, you briefly touched on the use of a communication device, but I would love for you to tell us what
Sure.
happened as Ben got older.
Um, so Ben stayed in the public system, public school system, until the age of 21. That's the end point, right? He aged out of the system. And for, I guess, probably the first 10 years, uh, he just advanced to the next level, next grade. He was part of, he had a, what do they call it, an IEP, or a special education plan, right? And wasn't anything to do much with academics, because nobody knew how to teach him. And it was just, that's how you've got people through the system. And we always, I guess, believed that he was a genius trapped in a body that didn't work, that just because he couldn't express um, what he thought, or he couldn't speak to us, that didn't mean that he didn't understand what was going on around him. And so we assumed, from a very early age, that we'll just talk to him like we do his siblings, and whether he responds or not doesn't matter. We just keep assuming that he understands everything. And it came to the point where, I guess, when Ben was in first year of high school, it was a different environment, because up until, elementary and middle school, the kids are younger, but high school is different. It was a different transition. And it was far more focused on academics, because, of course, then you can go to, post-secondary college or university. And so the environment was different, and the focus was different. And at that point, we had gone to a high school. Actually, the high school that Ben went was the same high school that my wife and I graduated from. So you're an alumnus, and the staff there, the principal and the administrators and all the teachers, most of the teachers, they were like second to none. They wanted to know, okay, we don't know how to teach Ben, but how do we do it? What do we need to do? And of course, well, I don't know what you need to do. You're the educator. But it came to the point where, I because I had been in IT, I thought there's got to be some technology that Ben could use to help with learning or communicating, or whatever. I had no idea. And we had talked to local SLPs, and they weren't really that helpful. They like most experts, sort of assumed Ben couldn't do much because of all the other things, and they kind of wrote him off because of that. And then, but I didn't buy it. And one of the things that Ben has taught us is to never take no for an answer. Just keep going until the right person says yes. And so I thought, okay, there's got to be technology. So I found this conference in Orlando, which I learned later happens every January. It's the Assistive Technology Industry Association's annual conference. And I looked at it, and there's thousands of people that go there. And I thought, well, there's got to, and there were vendors, right? So I thought, well, I've got to go and see what is out there, and see what technology could help him. And in fact, there was all kinds of technology that could help him. And I went to, it was also an academic conference, and one of the presentations I went to was a prof from Louisiana State, and she talked about this child who was a little bit younger than Ben, whom everyone had written off and said, he can't learn to do anything around communication. And in the period of 12 months, she got him using a communication device with eye gaze. And so I thought, well, geez, that could be Ben, right? Like, who is this person, right? So when I got home, I, all pumped that this is going to happen, right? And then, of course, you hit reality, and there's all these people saying, you're dreaming, Mike. That's never going to happen. And all the naysayers. But I did get in touch with this prof. I sent her an email, and she responded fairly quickly and we got on a conversation, a phone conversation, and she said, "Okay, let's try him with a device to see if it will actually work." Because maybe it's just me dreaming that it could happen, and there was absolutely no way it could. But if we got a trial of a device, then maybe that would tell the story. And so she was able to secure one. She's in New Orleans, and I'm in Atlantic, Canada, and she knew enough people in another province that one of the vendors to actually loan us one for a couple of weeks, because these devices are super expensive. And we trialed it with Ben. We would put it in front of him, and he would look this way, and you put it over there, and he'd look that way. And for like every day for 2 weeks, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And then finally, on the last day, he actually triggered it with his eyes, and it said something, and just by chance. And he looked at it again, and it said something else. And it was right then and there he realized that he did it. It wasn't me. And that was the turning point to say, well, it's possible, right? He gets it. He can see that he did that. And so I had, recorded those, put them up on YouTube for this prof to look at, shared them that way. And she said, yeah, that's perfect. Let's do this. And so it took probably 3 years of advocating and trying to get funding, because these things are 20 grand. And, would it even make any sense? And Ben got his first communication device with eye gaze in the final year of high school. And that changed everything. But in the meantime, this prof actually came to New Brunswick to help other SLPs learn about how you communicate with, kids like Ben, if I can say that. And these teachers were super keen. And so they actually started building picture boards about the different academic topics, about history and science and different things. And he actually wrote his first test in high school by using one of these picture boards. And they asked the question, and there were 4 answers, and he, depending on where he looked, was one of the answers. And they wrote it down what he chose. And his first test, he got like 70% or something. And it was, wow, this is really cool. But it was very onerous to create all these picture boards, right? Until he finally got this device on the last year of high school. And then things were just sort of starting to get going. And he could start actually communicating, because he uses eye gaze to find the right words, and the words are spoken right from this device. And we call it his talker. But at that point we thought, okay, we're just getting started, and he's graduating, right? Now what? So we looked around for post-secondary, and the university that's here in this province actually offers what they call a certificate program of general studies. And what that is you don't have to have the academic requirements to get in, of course, because Ben didn't have any, because for 20 years he didn't have any academics training. Or it's also for older students who may want to think they go back and maybe universities for me, maybe want to go back and learn something new. And so we started it without any. All we had was this talker, one of his caregivers, and me. We didn't have any education assistance, which you do in the public system, because now you're out on your own. And the university would say, let's try it. We have no idea how it's going to go, right? Let's just see if this is even possible. And so he went and did his first course. And actually these courses are the same ones that any university student would take, just because it's in the certificate program, because it's part-time. So they weren't sort of simpler courses or, watered down in any sort of way. It was the same courses that every other student was taking, maybe towards a degree program or something like that. And the first course he took and the first test he took, he didn't pass. He passed the course, but he didn't pass the first test. And so they looked at it and thought, okay, how can we make this more accessible in terms of providing the test so we can see what he's answering? And eventually, they got into a bit of a rhythm of how they do it. He had he was able to write his tests, or his exams or midterms separately, because he needed more time, but he was using this talker to do everything, right? And that simply changed everything. And it took him 6 years, but he graduated from the University of New Brunswick with a
Amazing.
certificate in general studies, right? And this is the same. So this is someone who's never been taught, right? But we always assumed that he learned he heard everything that you were telling him, and he was able to digest the content of a university level course, figure it out, right, do well enough on the tests and any of the assignments to actually pass them. And eventually we had to hire people. We had to get people, and there was funding for part-time education assistants at that level. So I mean, it couldn't be me and just one of his caregivers, but eventually we got a team going who was consistent, and they kind of figured out the rules. And I mean, it was amazing that he actually stayed with it that long and could actually pass enough to actually get the certificate.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you
It
for
is. He
sharing
is
that.
amazing. Yeah.
Is there anything else that we haven't touched on yet that you feel like, oh man, I need to make sure that people know this, or something from your own story that you would like to share? Is there anything we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I guess the only other thing is, I guess what we would call the other side of caregiving. So there's all the doing, right? And there's the stress and the burden and the anxiety of everything that's around caregiving. But there is another side to it where it's, there is joy and there's fulfillment in all of this. And that's the one thing it takes time for you to see that and believe it, especially if you're trying to do it all yourself. But there is a lot of fulfillment in doing this. And if you can get to and see that other side of caregiving, everything changes. And I can tell you that we wouldn't have lasted 30 years if we only were on the stress and the burden and the pain side. That you can see that there is this other side to it, where it actually is none of that. There's still a lot of stuff you have to deal with. That doesn't go away. There's still fear every day and, some loneliness, but it's offset by, a much more positive picture of how life really is. And then those things aren't as overwhelming, and they don't, cloud your day as much. Sure, there's highs and lows, and there's some good days and bad days. But once you've seen that other side, it's there and you know how to get back to it. And that's one of the things we want to help families just experience, right? And because that will get you through the next crisis, because there is that positive side to caregiving and to life that's whatever it's throwing at you.
That is a wonderful way to wrap up this conversation. For all of the people listening who are wanting to know more about your work, of course, I'll put links to everything in the show notes. But is it the New Pink Book? Is that the website?
Yeah, newpinkbook.com.
Newpinkbook.com.
Yeah, okay. That'll get you there. Yeah.
Excellent. So everybody should definitely go check out, if you are taking care of someone in your life, whether it's a child or a parent or a spouse, or if you're anticipating just wanting to make sure that your loved ones are cared for well in the case that something happens to you. The Pink Book is a tremendous resource, and I'm excited as I've gotten to hear a little bit more about the things that you have in store for different and additional ways to support families who are on their caregiving journey. So just thank you very much for all of your personal insight and your professional expertise on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Morgan. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Yes. And for all of my listeners, before we go, P.S. we expire.